chivalry dead yet? No, contrary to what you may have heard, chivalry is not dead. But maybe that's not such a good thing? Now, I know those very words have been spoken and typed in like a bazillion think pieces, but there's more to this story. Unlike the kindness and bravery that any person ought to be able to demonstrate on behalf of any other person, the idea of chivalry underwrites a set of behavioral patterns and cultural dispositions which not only reinforce dominance of men over women, but also buy into the idea that the use of violence is normal, acceptable, or even desirable. And it's the point about violence that I want to focus on today. Now, before we go any further, let me assure you that I will not be bashing masculinity as such in this video. There are many good and healthy ways to perform one's masculinity. What I am going to try to do is describe and critique one kind of masculinity which can contribute to damaging assumptions about gender and society, even with the best of intentions. Just a content warning that later in this video I will be talking in general terms about rape culture. Chivalry has a long, jagged line connecting it to a history of violence and misogyny. And by considering the past, we can more easily grasp how modern ideas of chivalry contribute to a culture of militarism that predominates in the here and now. The straightest line in this story is the derivation of the word chivalry, which comes from a medieval French collective noun signifying a group of knights, Chivalry. Medieval scholar Paul B. Sturtevant writes that when the term began to be used to describe knightly ideologies in the later Middle Ages, it described the attribute most coveted by knights, prowess. Since knighthood was a warrior aristocrat culture, that prowess was usually martial. This is important. Knights were warrior aristocrats, men whose very existence as knights was predicated on a great deal of violence, both fighting wars but also enforcing strict divisions between the nobles who owned the land and the serfs who lived on the land but were kept in a state of dependency on the nobles. We should keep in mind too that the prowess Sturtevant describes as being so central to chivalric ideals of knighthood revolves around competition between guys. Who can fight best, who has the best reputation, who has the most lovers. Sturtevant explains that what we think of chivalry today comes from reactions and counter-reactions from the other male powers that were. Over the Middle Ages, he writes, religious writers strove to couple that prowess with virtue. This was done to impose a culture of restraint on what often was a group of aristocratic thugs with something to prove. The virtuous knight thus became solidified as an ideal that is evinced in a variety of aspirational late medieval literature. But in actual practice, these values remained secondary to martial prowess. Chivalric ideals were rarely put into practice as anything other than ostentatious showmanship, or a rationalization of illicit love affairs. Sturtevant points to some medieval literature about knights for examples of the ideals associated with chivalry, like this passage from the knightly romance The Squire of Low Degree. In Tuscany and in Lombardy, there he did great chivalry. In Portugal nor yet in Spain, there might no man stand against him. And wheresoever that knight did fare, the worship with him away he bore. Note how doing great chivalry here revolves around male confrontation and dominating others. Or take this passage from the poetic tale Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, where Lady Bertilac, who is married, addresses Sir Gawain, who is in his bed. I would be knowing from thee, said that dear lady, and you were not wroth thereat, how it cometh to pass that thou who art so young and active, so courteous and so knightly as thou art known to be, and so given to chivalry, which is the most praiseworthy of all things, and so well versed in the loyal sport of love and in the science of arms, art yet so slow in love-making. You can see that in addition to militarism, how closely male sexuality is inhering in this idea of chivalry, to the extent that Lady Bertilac can put Sir Gawain's masculinity in question by pointing to his failure to make advances on her. In fact, chivalry represents a synthesis of militant masculinity and sexuality. Under this paradigm, the loyal sport of love and the science of arms are two sides of the same coin. You might have heard of this dynamic by another name, the battle of the sexes. Philosopher Tom Digby writes in his book Love and War how militarism shapes sexuality and romance about what he calls heterosexual adversariality. Digby observes that societies that are war-reliant, meaning the ones that tend to rely on group violent force to resolve problems with other societies, so most societies, also tend to enforce ideas of really rigid gender opposition. And the idea that men and women are fundamentally opposite doesn't exist in a vacuum. In fact, Digby says that it's a product of militaristic culture. And militaristic culture breeds misogyny. It devalues women. Here are some of the factors that Digby thinks are involved in the way that this plays out. First, at the center of militaristic culture is a faith in masculine force to solve problems. This faith presumes that adversariality is the way the world works, which leads to zero-sum thinking. A gain for you must mean a loss for me. Third, militarism traditionally requires a society to raise some of its population to be warriors. This factor has several consequences historically. Men are predominantly chosen to be warriors since they're understood as being more expendable compared to women who must be protected as breeders to restore populations after wars. This leads to the coercive enforcement of rigid gender opposition in strict binaries: dominant, submissive, aggressive, passive, hard, soft, strong, weak, logical, emotional, competitive, cooperative, etc. This enforcement hurts both men and women in different ways. Militarism breeds misogyny by enforcing a rigid, binary, oppositional, zero-sum worldview. Traits and behaviors that are seen as feminine, like emotional sensitivity, empathy, pacifism, are devalued in contrast to what Digby calls warrior masculinity, which at its core is about managing the capacity to care about the suffering of others and oneself in order to more easily kill when called to do so. Under these conditions, both men and women are able to police and coerce men when they don't fit the mold of this masculinity by comparing them with women. Digby demonstrates this with the so-called Hurt Feelings Report, which was originally created by some US soldiers to distribute at places where their comrades would go if they had PTSD. The form is designed to mock men for emotional sensitivity and psychological trauma by equating them with women. What becomes clear is that policing men to be masculine relies on deeply misogynistic ideas. As Digby puts it, to be female is to have a status that is deeply despised and feared by boys and men. That is why misogyny is such an effective means of culturally policing their lives. But what does any of this stuff have to do with chivalry? Doesn't chivalry respect women by opening doors for them and pulling back their chairs and paying their dinner bills? Well, does that really represent respect for women as equals? Digby puts it this way. Paradoxically, misogyny does not imply an absence of chivalry. Chivalry is individualistic, whereas misogyny is directed toward a group. Chivalry is directed toward an individual woman and signifies her dependence upon a particular chivalrous man to defend her, to open doors, or to pull chairs back from the table at a restaurant. So chivalry is not at all premised on actual respect for a woman. Rather, it's premised on an assumption that a woman is weak and dependent on a strong man. That helps us see how chivalry is not only consistent with misogyny, it reinforces it. It's important to note that this is not an indictment of particular men's intentions, which are probably, for the most part, just fine. Rather, this is about how chivalry functions and intersects with a culture of militarism and misogyny. In a roundtable discussion on this topic, Ellie Gordon Marshall describes what happened when she declined when a man offered to give up his seat on the bus for her. At the next stop, a bunch of people got off, and so I sat down, and he said to me, "See, you did want a seat." I responded, "How does it make any sense for me to have a seat over you? I'm obviously young and able-bodied." So then we got into a public argument about treating women well. It's a little clearer in this case how chivalry functions to assert male dominance and female dependence. When Gordon Marshall declined, this man took it as an affront to his masculine identity. If this man were trying to be universally kind rather than chivalrous, then he wouldn't have gotten upset when she declined his offer, and he might have been more on the lookout to offer a seat to someone who really was less able-bodied, regardless of gender. On the one hand, as Carissa Raponen says in the same roundtable, men think that opening a car door, offering a seat on transit, or paying the dinner bill is doing enough to show that they value women. Importantly, these services are offered on an individual basis. Meanwhile, chivalry isn't really concerned with the equality or well-being of women generally. On the other hand, chivalry underwrites the idea that men are the unique protectors and avengers of women when they are mistreated. This, too, is on an individual basis and does nothing to address the cultural programming that reproduces misogyny in the first place. In fact, chivalry's assumptions of male dominance and strength and female weakness is itself an acceptance of the normality, the givenness of the ways women's lives are structured around the fear of rape. Digby, citing Tim Beneke, writes, "The threat of rape alters the meaning of the night, makes women dependent on men for security, inhibits their ability to enjoy solitude in nature, requires them to spend more on rent to live in safe places and more on cars to ensure safe transportation, constrains their public expressions and the freedom of their eyes, and inflects with fear their experience of male company, even the company of friends. Instead of taking a step back to examine the cultural factors that produce misogyny, militarism, media representation, economic inequality, child rearing, to name a few, chivalry just assumes that these things are natural and inevitable. But not every society is or has been war-reliant. Digby cites research that shows at least 74 societies that do not make war, and it's reflected in the ways that their genders treat each other. When we realize that the warrior masculinity that's so central to chivalry is not natural or inevitable, but the product of cultural forces, then we can think about ways to interrupt those forces and consider better ways to practice and perform our masculinity. Chivalry is interested in a very narrow range of kindnesses, but I say that a better masculinity looks for equity and justice for everybody. A better masculinity than chivalry will hold doors and give up seats and practice kindness not just to women but to everybody, and especially to those who are less able-bodied than themselves. A better masculinity than chivalry will reject force as a way of centering identity and relationships. It will see men and women as equally valuable and capable human beings. As Digby concludes, examining, challenging, and overcoming militant masculinity means fewer men killing and beating and raping and harassing women and other men. It means less misogynistic harassment and discrimination that keep girls and women from reaching their full potential, which is debilitating both to them and to the entire economy. It opens whole new possibilities for men and women to love each other, as partners and spouses, as friends, as colleagues and co-workers, as neighbors. Instead of worrying about whether we can keep chivalry alive or not, let's move on and figure out ways that we can live more justly, kindly, equitably, and peaceably with everyone.